Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries, and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Joan of Arc, a heroine's trial. In the annals of history, few figures shine as brightly as Joan of Arc, a young woman who defied the constraints of her time to lead armies, challenge kings, and alter the fate of a nation. Born into obscurity in a rural French village, Joan's rise to prominence was nothing short of extraordinary. Guided by unwavering faith and visions she believed to be divine, she embarked on a journey that would see her transform from an illiterate peasant girl to a legendary military leader. At a time when France teetered on the brink of collapse during the 100 Years' War, Joan emerged as an unlikely savior. Her victories on the battlefield, particularly at Orléans, not only turned the tide of war, but also inspired a fractured nation to believe in itself once more. Yet, her ascent was met with equal measures of admiration and suspicion. The very institution she fought to protect would ultimately abandon her, leading to one of history's most infamous trials. This documentary delves deep into the life, battles, and betrayal of Joan of Arc. From her miraculous rise to her tragic downfall, we follow her journey step by step, uncovering the forces that shaped her fate. Her trial was more than a judgment of one woman. It was a battle for control, truth, and legacy. Despite her execution, Joan's spirit endured, inspiring generations and cementing her place as a symbol of courage and conviction. Now we retrace her path through history, exploring the moments that defined her and the trial that sought to erase her. This is Joan of Arc, a heroine's trial. Part 1. A World in Turmoil. France in the 100 Years' War. The winds of war had long swept across the lands of France, leaving devastation in their wake. For nearly a century, the kingdom had been caught in a brutal struggle with England, a conflict that would come to be known as the 100 Years' War. What had begun as a dynastic dispute over the French throne had spiraled into a relentless cycle of bloodshed, shifting alliances, and unending strife. By the early 15th century, France stood at the brink of collapse, its lands fractured, its people weary, and its future uncertain. The roots of the war trace back to 1337, when Edward III of England laid claim to the French crown, challenging the rule of Philip VI. This assertion ignited hostilities between the two great kingdoms, plunging France into chaos as it struggled to repel the English threat. Over the decades, battles raged across the countryside, with legendary clashes such as Crécy and Poitiers solidifying England's dominance on the field. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 brought a temporary respite, but it failed to secure lasting peace. Instead, the conflict rekindled, growing ever more ruthless as the years passed. By the early 1400s, France was at its weakest. King Charles VI, known as the Mad, suffered from severe bouts of insanity, leaving the realm without strong leadership. In his absence, rival factions vied for control, deepening the divisions within the kingdom. The Armagnacs and the Burgundians, two powerful noble houses, became locked in a bitter civil war, their ambitions overshadowing the greater threat posed by England. With the French nobility at odds, the English struck with renewed force, led by the formidable Henry V. His victory at Agincourt in 1415 was nothing short of catastrophic for France, as thousands of its knights fell before the English longbow. The humiliating defeat shattered French morale, paving the way for England's continued advance. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 delivered yet another blow. In a shocking agreement, Charles VI disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles, and recognized Henry V as the rightful heir to the French throne. This betrayal ensured that upon Charles VI's death, the crown of France would pass not to his son, but to the infant Henry VI of England. The legitimacy of the French monarchy had never been more precarious. As the English tightened their grip, Paris fell under Anglo-Burgundian control, and much of northern France lay in enemy hands. The Dauphin, forced into exile in the south, could do little to reclaim his birthright. In the occupied territories, the common people bore the brunt of the suffering. Towns were pillaged, farmlands burned, and entire villages reduced to ashes. Mercenary bands, once employed by feuding lords, now roamed the countryside unchecked, leaving destruction in their wake. The misery of war had become an inescapable reality for the French peasantry, their hopes for deliverance dwindling with each passing year. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, disease spread unchecked, and whispers of despair filled the air. While the nobility schemed and fought over thrones, the people died forgotten. And yet, in the midst of darkness, the first embers of hope began to stir. Whispers of prophecy spread from village to village, tales of a maiden sent by divine will to rescue France from its ruin. No one knew where she would come from, nor when she would appear. But faith was all that remained. Soon, from an obscure village in Lorraine, a young girl would step forward with a claim so bold, so unthinkable, that it would shake the kingdom to its core. France was about to witness the birth of its most unlikely savior. Part 2. The Maid of Domrémy. Joan's early life and visions. The village of Domrémy lay nestled in the rolling countryside of Lorraine, a quiet, unassuming place far removed from the courts of kings and the clashing of armies. Yet even here the shadow of war loomed large. The 100 Years' War had seeped into every corner of France, and though Domrémy remained loyal to the Dauphin, it stood perilously close to the Burgundian-held territories. Raiding bands swept through the land, leaving homes smoldering and fields trampled into dust. For the people of Domrémy, survival meant endurance, prayer, and an unshakable hope that deliverance would one day come. It was in this world of hardship and faith that Joan was born in 1412. The daughter of Jacques and Isabelle d'Arc, she grew up in a devout and hard-working family. Her father, a respected farmer, ensured that his children lived modest yet disciplined lives, and Joan, like the other girls, was taught the duties of the household: spinning, weaving, and tending to the animals. But unlike most, Joan possessed a quiet intensity, a fierce devotion that set her apart. From an early age, she displayed an unshakable faith, spending long hours in church, her lips moving in whispered prayers. She listened intently to the sermons, absorbing every word, every lesson, as though they carried secrets meant only for her. Despite the hardships around her, Joan's childhood was not without its moments of peace. She wandered through the fields, feeling the earth beneath her feet, the wind against her skin. The village church bell rang in the distance, a familiar sound of comfort and constancy. Yet even as she lived the simple life of a peasant girl, war was never far away. She had heard the cries of those fleeing burning villages, seen the fear in the eyes of neighbors when rumors of enemy raids reached their ears. She knew that her people suffered, and deep in her heart, something stirred, a longing she could not yet name. Then, at the age of 13, Joan's world changed forever. While alone in her father's garden, she heard a voice, clear, commanding, yet gentle. At first, she thought she had imagined it, but then a radiant presence filled the space around her. She fell to her knees, trembling, as the vision unfolded before her. Before her stood St. Michael, the warrior archangel, his armor gleaming, his gaze both fierce and kind. He told her of her destiny, that she would lead France to victory and restore the Dauphin to his rightful throne. Overwhelmed and afraid, Joan told no one. But the voices returned. They came again and again, growing in strength and clarity. Soon, she recognized them, St. Catherine and St. Margaret, speaking to her with the same message. They urged her to act, to seek out the Dauphin, to take up arms in defense of France. How could she, a mere peasant girl, do such a thing? The thought was absurd, terrifying even. She argued with them in prayer, pleaded for another path, but the voices did not waver. She had been chosen, and there would be no turning away from her fate. Her silence could not last forever. Word of Joan's strange behavior began to spread among those closest to her. Her father, ever practical and wary, dismissed her claims, warning her not to speak of such things. Others were skeptical, thinking her imagination had simply run wild. But Joan remained steadfast, unwavering. She knew what she had seen, what she had heard. The more she prayed, the stronger her certainty grew. She could no longer ignore her calling. By the time she was 16, Joan could no longer remain in Domrémy. The voices had given her a clear command. She must go to Robert de Baudricourt, the Dauphin's captain at Vaucouleurs, and demand to be taken to Charles himself. It was an impossible mission, a journey fraught with danger and doubt. A teenage girl, clad in simple wool, walking into the halls of men who ruled with steel and blood. And yet, despite everything, she knew she had no choice. She would go. She would stand before princes and warriors, and she would make them listen. Because her path was not her own, it had been written in heaven. Part 3. Answering the call. Seeking an audience with the Dauphin. Joan's decision to leave Domrémy was not one she made lightly. Her visions had become a persistent fire, burning in her soul, pushing her toward something greater than herself. Every day, she heard the voices urging her to fulfill her divine mission. Yet each day she remained in her village, the weight of the world seemed to close in around her. But the time had come to act, to step into the unknown, to leave the safety of home and face a world that would either reject or embrace her destiny. The risks were great. The journey was dangerous, and the possibility of failure loomed over her like a dark cloud. But the urgency she felt, the conviction that her purpose was divinely ordained, made the choice clear. With no wealth, no noble title, and no army to back her, Joan embarked on the perilous journey to Vaucouleurs, a fortified town that held the key to reaching the Dauphin, Charles VII. She traveled alone, a peasant girl, unarmed and vulnerable, through forests and fields where English soldiers roamed, searching for those who would challenge their reign. As she walked, she wondered if the journey would prove too much, if she would be turned away as an imposter, her visions dismissed as madness. The path was long and fraught with danger, but Joan's faith never wavered. Every step, every mile she put behind her, she felt the presence of her voices urging her forward. When she finally arrived at Vaucouleurs, Joan's heart pounded in her chest as she sought an audience with Robert de Baudricourt, the town's captain. The man she sought was a battle-hardened soldier, skeptical and world-weary, a man who had seen enough false prophets and charlatans to be easily convinced by a peasant girl's tale. Joan presented herself not as a mere girl, but as the chosen messenger of God, sent to free France from the grip of invaders. Yet Baudricourt laughed at her, dismissing her claims as the ravings of a naive child. He saw no warrior in her, only a dreamer too foolish to understand the enormity of the war she sought to enter. He ordered her to return home, dismissing her with the same contempt he had shown to so many others before her. But Joan did not relent. She did not falter, and with unshakable resolve, she begged to be heard again. Her persistence began to stir something in Baudricourt, and over time, he began to listen. Word of the girl with the divine mission spread across the town, attracting both curiosity and ridicule. Some scoffed at the idea of a young woman leading an army, while others wondered if perhaps there was something more to her story. Joan's growing reputation became a force of its own, drawing more attention than she had ever anticipated. The day came when Baudricourt finally relented. He agreed to grant Joan an armed escort to take her to Chinon, where Charles VII awaited. It was a hesitant step, but one that Joan knew was the beginning of something far greater. Her transformation was already underway. Joan, the peasant girl, had become Joan, the warrior of divine purpose. The moment she was entrusted with a small group of soldiers to protect her on the road, she knew there was no turning back. In order to better blend in and ensure her safety, Joan was advised to wear men's clothing for the journey. Disguised in armor and the garb of a soldier, she took on the persona of a warrior, though it was a role she had never trained for. This act of disguise marked the first of many steps in her transformation into a figure of destiny. As she crossed through enemy territory, the danger grew with each passing mile. She had no protection other than the will of God, and the uncertainty of what awaited her at Chinon made every step a test of faith. When Joan finally arrived at Chinon, her heart was filled with equal parts fear and resolve. She would face Charles VII, the Dauphin, who had heard the rumors of the peasant girl sent by God, but had never seen her face to face. Would he believe her? Would he see the truth of her words? Joan did not know what awaited her, but she had no doubt that the divine mission had brought her this far. The voices told her that her journey was far from over, and that her greatest challenge was still to come. Part 4. The Test of Faith, Joan's Examination by Church Authorities. Upon arriving at Chinon, Joan found herself thrust into a world far beyond the quiet fields of Domrémy. No longer a peasant girl, she was now a figure of immense importance, her every move scrutinized and weighed by those who would determine her fate. The Dauphin, Charles VII, had already heard of her divine mission, but the question that lingered was whether this young woman, clad in armor, truly possessed the grace of God, or whether she was merely a clever fraud. Joan's vision, her claim to divine guidance, would soon be tested by the very authorities who represented the heart of the Church in France. The Church's scrutiny was unyielding, and Joan knew that her trial would be a pivotal moment in her journey. There were those within the Church who could not accept a woman, much less a peasant girl, taking center stage in a war that threatened the very fabric of French society. To them, she was an enigma, someone who had overstepped her place, daring to speak of divine messages and visions without the authority of the clergy. Joan was summoned to stand before an ecclesiastical court, the tribunal that would determine whether her actions were divinely inspired or the delusions of a madwoman. The court, assembled in the town of Poitiers, was composed of churchmen, theologians, and inquisitors who would question her faith, her visions, and the validity of her claim to divine mission. As Joan entered the room, she must have felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. The air was thick with suspicion and hostility, as many of the clergy present were already determined to dismiss her as a dangerous fanatic. Yet Joan, unwavering in her faith, stood before them with a calm that belied her youth and gender. She was prepared to answer their questions, to prove her worthiness, and to demonstrate that she was indeed the instrument of God's will. The questioning began, and Joan answered with certainty, speaking with an authority that even the most skeptical could not ignore. She described her visions with clarity, recounting the voices of St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret, who had given her the mission to liberate France and restore the Dauphin to his rightful throne. The inquisitors pressed her with difficult questions, seeking to trap her in contradictions or force her into revealing doubts that would disqualify her as a divine messenger. Yet Joan's answers were consistent and unwavering. She spoke of her unwavering faith, of how she had heard the call to action, and how she had obeyed it without question. But the tribunal did not only question Joan's divine mission. They also sought to test her knowledge of the scriptures and her understanding of church doctrine. Joan's answers, while simple, were profound. She was not a scholar, but her deep connection to her faith was undeniable. She spoke of the simplicity of God's message, of how the Lord did not choose the wise and the powerful, but the humble and the meek. Her words, though unschooled in the language of theology, struck a chord with those present, leaving some of her interrogators uneasy about dismissing her too easily. The churchmen sought to exploit her gender, questioning her decision to wear men's clothing, something that was not only unconventional, but also seen as a challenge to the established order of gender roles. Joan stood firm, stating that she wore the attire to protect herself and to fulfill her mission, for her role was not one of mere womanhood, but of divine purpose. In this moment, Joan demonstrated the strength of her character, her willingness to defy societal norms in the pursuit of something far greater than herself. The tribunal was a grueling test, but Joan's faith never wavered. She answered their questions with clarity, courage, and a sense of divine purpose that left some of her interrogators questioning their own faith. Her unwavering belief in her mission shone through in every word, every gesture, every movement. Despite the efforts of the ecclesiastical court to break her, Joan passed the examination with flying colors. Her trial proved that she was no simple peasant girl, but a woman with the strength of conviction and the belief that she had been chosen by God for a mission that would change the course of history. Yet the church, wary of a woman rising to such prominence, would not release Joan from their scrutiny so easily. This would not be the last time she would face trial, nor the last time her faith and courage would be tested. Part 5. The Siege of Orléans, a turning point in the war. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and fear as Joan and her small entourage arrived at the besieged city of Orléans, a pivotal stronghold in the 100 Years' War. For months, the English had encircled the city, cutting off all supplies and threatening to break the last bastion of resistance in France. Within the city's walls, morale was low, and defeat seemed inevitable. Yet as Joan set foot on the battlefield, the weight of her divine mission settled more heavily upon her, a clear sense of purpose pushing her forward. She was not simply a soldier. She was the voice of salvation, the divine instrument chosen to lead France out of the abyss. Joan's arrival at Orléans was nothing short of miraculous. The city had long been trapped, its people desperate and exhausted. But as soon as the young maiden appeared, something changed. Her faith was infectious, igniting hope in the hearts of the weary defenders. She spoke of divine intervention, of the voices that had guided her, and of the inevitable victory that awaited them if they only had the courage to rise up. The soldiers, once demoralized and resigned to their fate, now found themselves infused with a new sense of strength and purpose. The plan to liberate Orléans was audacious, but Joan's strategy was simple and direct. She called for a series of attacks on the English fortifications, employing unconventional tactics that caught the enemy off guard. Joan was not a seasoned military leader, but she had the gift of inspiring men to follow her without question. Her confidence in the divine nature of her mission made her seem unstoppable, and her ability to read the situation on the battlefield was uncanny. Each strike, each maneuver, each piece of the plan fell into place as if guided by unseen hands. But the challenges were many. The English had fortified their positions, and the siege seemed insurmountable. Joan knew that victory would not come easily, yet she was undeterred. She rallied her forces with every ounce of energy, urging them forward with the promise of deliverance. As the days passed, the soldiers began to see results, with each skirmish turning the tide slightly more in their favor. The English, accustomed to overwhelming control, now found themselves on the defensive, their once unstoppable siege beginning to crumble under the weight of Joan's persistence and strategy. Joan's presence on the battlefield was not just a symbol of hope. It was a reminder that fate had not yet been sealed. She was the living embodiment of France's will to survive, a beacon for the people who had been forced into the shadows for far too long. As the French forces grew bolder and more coordinated under Joan's command, the siege began to unravel. The English, realizing that their grip on Orléans was slipping, began to retreat, their confidence shattered by the unyielding strength of the French resistance. Joan's victory was not merely a tactical triumph, it was a spiritual one, as the people of France began to see her as the angel of deliverance sent by God to restore their nation. The fall of the English siege at Orléans marked a major turning point in the war. It was the first significant victory for the French in nearly a century of conflict, a victory that restored their belief in themselves and in their king. Joan had become a symbol of their resistance, a living legend who had not only led them to victory, but had also reignited the spirit of the nation. Orléans was liberated, and with it, a newfound sense of hope spread throughout France. Joan's mission was far from over, but this victory gave her the momentum to carry forward, to press on toward Reims, where the Dauphin awaited his coronation. In that moment, Joan knew that the tide had shifted. The English were no longer invincible, and France had reclaimed the strength it needed to resist the invaders. With every victory, the forces of destiny seemed to be aligning, and Joan, once a simple girl from Domrémy, had become the harbinger of France's future. Part 6. Victory and Recognition. The Road to Reims. With the liberation of Orléans, Joan of Arc had delivered the turning point France so desperately needed. The news of her victory spread like wildfire across the land, and the French people, once beleaguered and demoralized, now had a symbol of hope to rally around. She was no longer just the Maid of Orleans. She had become a force of nature, a beacon of divine purpose, leading France toward an uncertain but promising future. Yet Joan knew that this was only the beginning of her mission. The true test of her success lay not in her victory at Orleans, but in what was to come next, the coronation of Charles VII at Reims. Reims was sacred ground for the French, for it was here that the kings of France had been crowned for centuries. The Dauphin, Charles VII, had been waiting for this moment since the first signs of Joan's arrival, but he knew that before any true claim to the throne could be made, he must be crowned as the legitimate king of France. The coronation at Reims would not only solidify his authority, but would also serve as a symbol of hope for the nation, an affirmation that the divine will had truly chosen him to lead France out of its suffering. Joan had seen this in her visions. She had been sent to lead Charles to Reims, to make him king, and she would not rest until her mission was complete. The journey to Reims, however, was fraught with dangers. As Joan and her forces marched northward, they encountered several challenges, both military and logistical. The English were not yet willing to accept defeat, and they launched numerous counterattacks to slow the French advance. Yet Joan, undeterred by the setbacks, continued to lead with the same fiery determination that had won her the victory at Orleans. The French soldiers followed her with unwavering loyalty, not only because of her military skill, but because they believed, truly believed, that she was the instrument of God's will. Along the way, Joan continued to inspire her troops, sharing her visions and reaffirming the divine nature of her mission. She spoke of her faith, reminding them that they were not simply soldiers fighting for a throne. They were fighting for God's will, for the restoration of France, and for the triumph of good over evil. Her words rang true, and as the French forces pressed on, they became more than just an army. They became a movement, united by purpose, faith, and the unwavering belief that victory was inevitable. When they finally arrived at Reims, the city was ready for them. The gates opened wide, and Charles VII was greeted by Joan, his loyal companion, who had led him to this very moment. The coronation was a moment of unparalleled significance for France. Charles VII, once the hopeless Dauphin, was now crowned as the rightful king of France. Joan stood by his side as he was anointed, her mission complete, yet her journey far from over. The crown was not just a symbol of political power, it was a symbol of divine favor, and it was Joan who had made it possible. The French people rejoiced, and for the first time in many years, the sun seemed to shine brightly on their future. Joan had accomplished the impossible. She had delivered a crown to the rightful king, restored the nation's faith in itself, and in doing so, had cemented her place in history. But even as Charles VII took his seat on the throne, Joan knew that her victory at Reims was not the end of her story. It was, in fact, only the beginning. Joan's recognition was not only political, but also spiritual. She was now the living embodiment of France's salvation, a symbol of divine intervention in a time of great darkness. Her triumphs were more than mere military successes. They were the fulfillment of her sacred mission, and France's future seemed more certain with every step she took. Yet, as Joan stood beside Charles, she was acutely aware of the dangers that lay ahead. The war was far from over, and the English were still determined to crush the French spirit. Joan's faith and resolve would be tested further, but she had already proven that with God's guidance, anything was possible. The road to Reims had been fraught with challenges, but Joan had overcome them all. Now, with the coronation complete, she turned her eyes to the next phase of the war, knowing that her mission was far from finished. Part 7. The Coronation of Charles VII, a triumph for Joan. The day of Charles VII's coronation dawned as one of unprecedented significance, not just for the French monarchy, but for Joan herself. For years, Charles had been the Dauphin, a symbol of a fractured kingdom and a king without a crown. But today, thanks to the efforts of the Maid of Orleans, he would take his rightful place on the throne. The journey to this moment had been filled with blood, sacrifice, and unwavering faith, and it was Joan who had brought him here. The city of Reims, revered for its sacred role in French coronations, became the stage for this momentous event. As Joan entered the cathedral beside Charles, her presence was a blend of awe and reverence. The people of Reims lined the streets, their cheers filling the air as the Maid, the girl who had led them through unimaginable trials, now stood as the architect of their king's ascension. The king's coronation was the culmination of her divine mission, and the air seemed thick with the divine energy that had followed her every step. Joan had not only fulfilled her vision, she had reshaped the very destiny of France. For Charles VII, the moment was both a personal triumph and a national rebirth. Once a hesitant and unsure figure, he was now confirmed as the rightful king of France, with the divine sanction that Joan had always promised him. As the sacred oils were poured over his head, the weight of the crown seemed to represent not just political power, but divine endorsement. Joan's role in this was unmistakable. The Dauphin was now a king because of her faith, her leadership, and the undying belief that her mission was the will of God. Joan watched in silence, her heart swelling with pride, but also a quiet sense of foreboding. Her mission was fulfilled, yet she knew that her journey was far from over. The coronation of Charles VII was not the end of the war, nor was it the end of her role in France's struggle for independence. The English were still entrenched in their position, and they would not surrender without a fight. But for now, Joan allowed herself a rare moment of peace, standing as the architect of a new era for France. As the coronation ceremony concluded and the people erupted in celebration, Joan, the humble shepherd girl turned warrior, had achieved what no one had thought possible. She had united a fractured kingdom under one king, restored faith to the French people, and shown the world that divine intervention was not a matter of myth, but a force that could alter the course of history. The crowning of Charles VII marked a turning point not only in the war, but in the history of France itself. It was a victory for the divine, a victory for the French people, and a victory for Joan, who had become not just a leader, but a legend. But as the celebrations continued, Joan's thoughts remained fixed on the challenges ahead. Her work was far from finished, and she was keenly aware that the English would not concede defeat easily. The victory at Reims was a monumental achievement, but the true test of her faith, her resolve, and her leadership was yet to come. Joan was no longer just the Maid of Orléans. She had become a symbol of France's resurgence, and the future of the country lay in her hands, even if she did not yet fully understand the weight of that responsibility. Part 8. New Challenges. Political Intrigue and Military Setbacks. The coronation of Charles VII in Reims was a victory unlike any other for Joan of Arc. She had accomplished what many thought impossible, leading the French king to his rightful throne and solidifying his legitimacy in the eyes of the people and the heavens. But as the echoes of celebration began to fade, the reality of the war returned with sharp force. The English were still very much present in France, and despite the symbolic victory of the coronation, the struggle for the kingdom was far from over. Joan, once a symbol of unshakable faith and military genius, now faced challenges far more complex than she had anticipated. France was not simply fighting a foreign enemy. It was battling its own divisions, political infighting, and the intricate web of alliances that had long plagued the kingdom. The French court, now more than ever, was a place of tension and competing interests. Joan, for all her divine purpose and battlefield prowess, was caught in a storm of courtly politics she had never fully understood. Charles VII, while now crowned king, still struggled to consolidate his power over the fractured factions within his own country. He was no longer just the young Dauphin. He was a monarch in need of alliances, and this meant navigating the complex political landscape of 15th century France. Among the most significant of these challenges were the infighting between factions at court, including the lingering tensions with Burgundy, whose alliance with the English threatened to unravel the fragile unity Joan had fought so hard to build. Joan, with her singular focus on divine will, was not interested in the nuances of political maneuvering or court diplomacy. Her only concern was the mission she believed God had given her: to liberate France, to lead the army to victory, and to ensure the crown remained securely on the head of Charles VII. Yet, her disregard for the political intricacies of the court soon became a point of contention among her allies. Military setbacks compounded Joan's troubles. With the momentum of her earlier victories, she had led the French army towards success, but not all of her campaigns met with the same triumph. The French forces had enjoyed a string of victories after Reims, but soon they encountered more determined resistance from the English, who were adapting their strategies and strengthening their positions. Joan's leadership was still crucial, but the enemy was becoming more formidable by the day. The siege of Paris, one of the key campaigns Joan had hoped to win, was particularly challenging. The city, well defended and strategically important, remained under English control, and despite Joan's fiery determination, the French forces were unable to breach its defenses. The political climate surrounding these military failures was complex, with some at court questioning Joan's tactics and others growing concerned about her inability to negotiate alliances or deliver results as expected. Joan's once unassailable position began to show cracks, and whispers of doubt crept into the royal court. Despite the setbacks, Joan's faith remained unwavering. She continued to preach that the French cause was righteous, that God was on their side, and that victory was still possible. But her growing isolation at court, coupled with military stumbles, made it increasingly difficult for her to rally the same level of enthusiasm from her troops. As the months dragged on and the French army faltered, it became clear that the road ahead would be far more difficult than she had ever imagined. Joan had arrived at Reims as a symbol of divine intervention, but now, in the aftermath of political infighting and military stasis, she was beginning to face the harsh realities of leadership. Her once clear path was clouded by obstacles, and as the political intrigue at court deepened, it became harder to distinguish between the will of God and the complicated human ambitions at play. Part 9. Betrayal at Compiègne. Joan's capture by the Burgundians. Joan of Arc had fought valiantly for France, but the tides of war were about to turn against her in the most devastating way. It was at the fortress of Compiègne, a strategic stronghold in the northeast of France, that her fate would be sealed. The city, long contested between the French and the English, was surrounded by a tenuous alliance of French and Burgundian forces, and Joan, once a symbol of hope, found herself in a battle that was more personal than any she had fought before. The Burgundians, who had long sided with the English in the war, were now the ones who would play a central role in Joan's downfall. Joan's relationship with the Burgundians had been strained from the start, but it was in the heat of the battle for Compiègne that the betrayal would occur. Joan, with her unrelenting courage, had led a French relief effort to break the siege and lift the city from English control. She remained confident, as always, in her divine mission, believing that God would guide her to victory. But in the midst of battle, the situation shifted rapidly. The French forces, already outnumbered, faced a sudden onslaught from the Burgundian forces, who had turned on Joan and her soldiers at the most critical moment. The French army, caught by surprise, was left vulnerable to the merciless assault of the Burgundians, who had no allegiance to the cause Joan had fought for. The betrayal was swift and ruthless. Joan was captured by the very people she had trusted, her fate now in the hands of those who had once been her allies. Her capture sent shockwaves through the French ranks. The Maid of Orléans, the girl who had led armies and inspired nations, was now a prisoner of war, her fate uncertain. The betrayal cut deep, not just for Joan but for the soldiers who had fought beside her, the French people who had placed their hope in her, and Charles VII, who now found himself without his most revered military leader. The king had been reliant on Joan's victories to cement his rule, and now, with her in enemy hands, his reign was more fragile than ever. As Joan was taken away, her heart remained resolute in her faith, but she could not ignore the crushing reality of the betrayal. She had been abandoned, left to the whims of those who had once called her a hero. For Joan, this was not just a military loss, but a deep spiritual trial, as she grappled with the notion that she had been forsaken by those who should have stood by her in her hour of need. Yet even in the face of this unimaginable turn of events, Joan's faith did not waver. She continued to believe that God's plan was still at work, even if she could not understand it. The news of Joan's capture spread quickly, sparking outrage among the French people and leaving the English and Burgundians alike to debate her fate. Some saw her as a valuable prisoner, a potential bargaining chip in negotiations, while others viewed her as a threat to their control over France, believing that her capture would mark the end of French resistance. But for Joan, this was not the end. It was merely the beginning of another chapter in her journey, one that would test her more than she had ever imagined. Part 10. Sold to the Enemy. Joan's fate in English hands. Joan of Arc had always believed in divine providence, but now, in the harsh reality of English captivity, her faith was about to face its greatest test. After her betrayal and capture at Compiègne, Joan was handed over to the English forces, the very enemy she had fought so relentlessly to defeat. This was not just a loss on the battlefield. It was a spiritual and emotional blow that would shake Joan to her core. The English, led by the ruthless and calculating Henry VI, were quick to recognize the symbolic power Joan held. Even in her imprisonment, she was no longer just a soldier. She had become the face of the French resistance, the emblem of their defiance against English occupation. To the English, Joan was both a prize and a threat, a young woman who had turned the tide of war, inspiring the French to rally behind their king and reclaim their lands. Joan was sold to the English as a prisoner of war, her fate now in their hands. She was subjected to a series of harsh conditions, forced into a foreign and hostile environment, where her every move was watched and her every word scrutinized. Yet, despite the brutality she faced, Joan remained a figure of defiance, a symbol of hope for the French who had not forgotten her courage and determination. Her imprisonment, however, marked the beginning of a new battle, one that was more psychological and spiritual than physical. The English saw in Joan not just a warrior, but a challenge to their authority and legitimacy in France. To neutralize her, they knew they had to break her spirit, to force her into submission, and to undermine the very belief system that had made her such a formidable opponent. But Joan, though trapped in enemy hands, refused to give up on her mission or her faith. She was not only fighting for her life, but for the vision of a free France she had carried in her heart from the beginning. Her resolve, however, would soon be tested by the English Church, who saw in her the potential for scandal and the need for her to be brought to heel. Joan's fate was sealed in a way the English had not anticipated. She was not simply imprisoned as a captured soldier. She was put on trial, forced to defend herself not just against the English, but against her own faith and the very visions that had guided her through every battle. The trial would be one of the most grueling challenges of her life, a test not of her courage, but of her unwavering belief in the divine mission she had been given. As Joan was paraded before the English court, the church and its leaders, eager to discredit her, painted her as a heretic, a witch, and a false prophet. They sought to strip her of the very essence that had made her a leader, her faith, her visions, and her divine calling. Yet, in the face of such overwhelming opposition, Joan's spirit remained unbroken. She continued to proclaim that she was a messenger of God, sent to fulfill a holy mission. Even if the world around her sought to silence her, her fate in the hands of the English was sealed, but Joan of Arc's unwavering resolve to remain true to her convictions made her an even more powerful figure. Even as she faced the greatest trials of her life, she did not give in to fear or despair. Part 11. The trial begins, a battle of faith and politics. Joan of Arc's capture by the English marked the beginning of an agonizing new phase in her life, a trial that would not only challenge her faith, but would also become a battleground for politics and power. The English, determined to crush her legacy and erase her influence, set the stage for a trial that would unfold like a twisted spectacle of manipulation and control. Joan's fate now lay in the hands of her accusers, the very people who had sought her downfall from the moment she first appeared on the battlefield. The trial, held in the city of Rouen, was led by a court eager to discredit Joan and dismantle the legend she had become. The English, in collaboration with the church, sought to paint her as a heretic, a blasphemer, and a woman who had betrayed God and the king by claiming divine visions and guidance. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the weight of politics as much as with religious fervor, for the English could not afford to allow Joan's message of divine support for France to remain unchallenged. Joan's accusers were not mere men of the cloth. They were political operatives who saw the trial as a chance to further their agendas, to cement English control over France and to reinforce the supremacy of the English crown and its claim to the throne. The church, too, had its own reasons for wanting to silence Joan, for her defiance of church authority threatened to undermine centuries of tradition and structure. The trial was not concerned with justice in any meaningful sense. It was a calculated move in a much larger political chess game. Joan, however, stood firm in her beliefs, resolute in her faith that she had been called by God to fulfill a divine mission. Even in the face of her accusers, her courage remained undiminished. Though she was subjected to relentless questioning and manipulation, Joan's responses were unwavering, always returning to her visions, her voices, and her certainty that God had guided her every step of the way. Her spirit, although physically battered by the rigors of captivity, remained a force to be reckoned with. Yet, as the trial wore on, Joan found herself caught between two worlds: the harsh reality of her imprisonment, where every word she uttered could be twisted into an accusation, and the vision of divine justice she held in her heart, a belief that refused to be extinguished no matter the earthly forces arrayed against her. The trial was not only a battle of faith, but a war for Joan's very soul, with each moment stripping away more of the hope that had once defined her, replacing it with the harsh reality that she was alone, surrounded by enemies, and powerless to change the course of her fate. Her accusers pressed on, questioning her every statement, her every vision, hoping to break her and force a confession that would serve to justify their actions and restore the legitimacy of the English claim to France. Despite the constant pressure, Joan did not waver in her assertion that she had been divinely inspired to act as she did. As the trial dragged on, the manipulation grew more obvious. The judges sought to trip Joan up with cunning questions, hoping to catch her in a contradiction that would undermine her credibility and prove her guilt. Yet Joan held fast, answering each question with the clarity of someone who truly believed in the divine mission she had received. Even when threatened with torture, she did not break, standing as an example of unwavering faith in the face of the most extreme opposition. Her trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a performance of power, a demonstration of the ways in which the English and their collaborators in the church sought to control not just the lives of individuals, but the very hearts and minds of the French people. Part 12. The Verdict, Condemnation, and Sentencing. After weeks of intense questioning, manipulation, and spiritual warfare, the inevitable moment arrived. Joan of Arc would face the judgment of those who had sought her destruction from the very beginning. The trial, a mockery of justice, was about to culminate in a decision that would forever alter the course of history and the legacy of one of France's greatest heroines. The court, composed of English sympathizers and members of the church eager to demonstrate their power, delivered its verdict. Joan was guilty of heresy, witchcraft, and blasphemy. They accused her of claiming divine visions and acting on them, calling her actions a betrayal of both God and the legitimate authority of the English crown. The court's decision was not based on any objective truth, but rather on the political and religious motives of those who wished to silence her, to destroy the symbol of French resistance she had become. For Joan, the verdict was not a surprise. She had known from the beginning that the trial was rigged against her, that her fate had already been sealed by forces beyond her control. Yet in that moment, as the court pronounced its judgment, something changed in Joan's demeanor. The weight of the charges against her, the weight of the entire trial, could not break her spirit completely. She remained defiant, her unwavering faith still evident in her eyes, though the physical and emotional toll of the trial had taken its toll. The sentence was nothing short of devastating. Joan was to be burned at the stake. Her life, her mission, and her very identity as a symbol of France's fight for freedom and justice would end in the most brutal of ways, in a public execution designed to humiliate her and silence her once and for all. The English and their allies in the church believed that by executing Joan, they would not only extinguish the flame of resistance, but also send a powerful message to the French people that their belief in Joan, in her divine mission, was misguided and false. But they underestimated the strength of Joan's spirit, the power of her legacy, and the deep love the French people had for her. As Joan stood before the court, the finality of the sentence settled over her, but she did not show fear or regret. She was a woman who had fought for her country, who had believed in a cause greater than herself, and who had followed her divine calling no matter the cost. With unshaken resolve, she reaffirmed her belief in God and her faith in the mission she had undertaken. She was at peace, knowing that no earthly authority could take away what she had carried in her heart from the beginning. As the sentence was announced, Joan's supporters and those who had followed her with such hope watched in horror. They knew that her death would not mark the end of her influence. It would only fuel the fire of rebellion and resistance among the French. But Joan, in that final moment, was beyond the reach of those who had sought her destruction. Her faith had already secured her place in the hearts of those who would never forget the Maid of Orleans, no matter what the English might do to erase her memory. Part 13. The Execution. Fire, Faith, and Final Words. The day of Joan of Arc's execution arrived with the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. Yet in the face of certain death, she stood resolute, her spirit undaunted by the horrors to come. The English, eager to extinguish the symbol of French resistance once and for all, had prepared a public execution in the heart of Rouen, a city that would become forever linked with Joan's martyrdom. The flames that would consume her body were meant to erase her legacy, to destroy the very essence of her being and the belief that she had been chosen by God to lead France to victory. As Joan was led through the streets toward the scaffold, the crowd that had gathered were filled with a mix of emotions, some with joy at the thought of seeing her finally silenced, others with grief and fear at the knowledge that they were witnessing the end of an era, the end of a dream that had once seemed so close to realization. Joan, bound and surrounded by guards, walked steadily, her eyes filled with the unwavering conviction that had carried her through her trials and battles. She was a woman who had never allowed fear to control her actions, and now, as the moment of her death drew near, she was still a woman of profound faith. Upon reaching the stake, Joan was stripped of her clothing and tied to the wood, ready to be consumed by the flames. Yet, even in her final moments, she maintained her dignity, her faith, and her courage. Her eyes never wavered from the cross, and she spoke words that would live on in the memory of those who witnessed her execution. Her final act of defiance was not one of rebellion, but one of deep spiritual conviction. She called out the name of Jesus Christ, affirming her belief in God's will for her life and her death. Joan's last words were a testament to her faith, a faith that had sustained her through countless trials, through battles, betrayals, and the isolation of captivity. She cried out not in fear or regret, but in peace, trusting that her soul was in God's hands, that her mission was not in vain, and that she had fulfilled her purpose, no matter the outcome. In her final moments, Joan remained the Maid of Orleans, the symbol of France's defiance against foreign occupation, the embodiment of courage in the face of insurmountable odds. The flames that began to rise around her were intended to destroy her, but instead they became a symbol of the strength of her faith, a faith that could not be consumed by fire, by politics, or by the manipulation of those who sought to make her a martyr for their cause. Her death, as brutal and tragic as it was, did not signify her defeat, but instead marked the beginning of her legacy as one of the most iconic figures in history. As the fire consumed her body, Joan's spirit lived on in the hearts of the French people, who would never forget the young woman who had led them with divine guidance, who had given everything for her country and her faith. Even in death, she became an enduring symbol of resistance, hope, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. Part 14. The Aftermath. France's changing perception of Joan. Joan of Arc's brutal execution did not extinguish the flame of resistance she had kindled. It fueled it in ways the English could never have anticipated. In the immediate aftermath of her death, the French people, initially devastated by the loss of their champion, began to experience a profound shift in their perception of Joan. She had died a martyr's death, a death that galvanized the hearts of the French in ways that no military victory could. Though the English and their allies in the church had believed that Joan's execution would demoralize the French and end the growing rebellion, the opposite occurred. The tragedy of Joan's death became a rallying cry for the French, particularly for those who had followed her through the trials and tribulations of the war. Her martyrdom was seen as a divine confirmation of her mission, and her influence continued to grow, transcending her physical death. The French monarchy, particularly Charles VII, began to realize the profound impact of Joan's legacy. Her death, while tragic, had turned her into a symbol of divine favor and national unity, a figure around whom the people could rally in their struggle for independence. In the years that followed, Charles VII's reign grew more secure, and the French forces, reinvigorated by the memory of Joan's courage, pressed on with renewed strength against the English invaders. Joan's martyrdom also began to take on a religious significance, particularly among the clergy and the common people of France. Her steadfast faith in God, her unwavering belief in her divine mission, and her courage in the face of death elevated her to a spiritual icon, one whose memory would become intertwined with the very soul of France. Though her execution had been designed to silence her, it instead magnified her influence, especially as France slowly began to reclaim its territories from the English. In the years after Joan's death, the tides of war began to shift in favor of the French, culminating in the eventual expulsion of the English from French soil. Joan's legacy, though not immediately recognized, became a cornerstone in the national consciousness, and her image as a symbol of resistance, divine inspiration, and courage persisted. But perhaps the most profound shift in perception came in the years following the war, when Joan's case was revisited by the Church. In 1456, a posthumous retrial prompted by French political and religious leaders reversed the charges of heresy and declared her innocent. The Catholic Church, recognizing the injustice of her trial and the sanctity of her mission, eventually led the way in her canonization, culminating in Joan's eventual recognition as a saint in 1920. This was a full-circle moment for the French people, whose once derided heroine was now elevated to the highest echelons of religious reverence and national pride. Joan's legacy lived on not only in France's eventual victory, but in the hearts of all who saw in her a symbol of faith, courage, and selflessness. Her story transcended borders and eras, influencing not only her country but the world at large. The image of the young peasant girl who had led a nation to victory was now enshrined in history as a testament to the extraordinary power of conviction, even in the face of death. Part 15. A Saint for the Ages, Joan's Legacy and Canonization. Joan of Arc's story didn't end with her tragic death. If anything, it marked the beginning of a legacy that would endure for centuries, growing in strength and reverence as the world came to recognize her extraordinary courage, faith, and impact on history. Though her death was meant to silence her, Joan's spirit only grew louder, her name etched into the heart of France, and her legend spreading beyond its borders. In the years following her execution, the French people's perception of Joan underwent a profound transformation. Initially, she had been seen as a symbol of resistance, a peasant girl who had risen to greatness and led her country to victory in its darkest hours. But as time passed, the French began to see her as something more, an icon, a symbol of divine inspiration and unwavering faith, someone whose life and death transcended the political struggles of her time. The political landscape of France had changed dramatically after Joan's death, with the English slowly losing ground in their long-standing war for control of French territory. Charles VII, whose coronation Joan had made possible, was firmly entrenched as the King of France, and his reign marked a turning point in the country's fortunes. Joan's death, though a personal tragedy, had helped solidify the national resolve to fight for France's independence, and her name became synonymous with national pride. Her legacy, however, was not confined to the political realm. Joan became a figure of profound religious significance as well. Her deep faith, her unwavering conviction that she had been divinely chosen to lead France, and her courageous sacrifice for her country became central to her growing legend. Over time, the Church, which had condemned her as a heretic during her trial, began to see her in a new light. In 1456, a posthumous retrial exonerated Joan, acknowledging the injustice of her trial and the wrongful charges of heresy and witchcraft. The Church formally declared her innocent, and her reputation was restored, though her canonization was still a long way off. But the retrial was a pivotal moment. It set the stage for the eventual recognition of Joan's holiness and her elevation to sainthood. Joan's canonization process took decades, but in 1920, after much deliberation and investigation, the Catholic Church officially declared Joan of Arc a saint. Her canonization was a powerful moment in history, not only for the people of France, but for the world at large. Joan, once condemned and forgotten, was now enshrined in the annals of history as a symbol of purity, courage, and divine intervention. Her canonization was a recognition not only of her martyrdom, but of the profound spiritual journey she had undertaken, from a peasant girl hearing voices to a warrior who had led armies, and ultimately, to a saint whose life embodied the ideals of faith, bravery, and sacrifice. Joan's sainthood was not merely a recognition of her death, but a celebration of her unwavering commitment to the divine will, and it solidified her place in history as one of the most powerful and inspirational figures of all time. Today, Joan of Arc stands as a beacon of strength and faith, a symbol of the power of conviction, and a reminder of the extraordinary potential that lies within every individual, regardless of their social status or background. Her legacy continues to inspire people around the world, her story echoing through the centuries as a testament to the enduring power of faith, determination, and hope. From her humble beginnings in Domrémy to her eventual canonization as a saint, Joan of Arc remains a figure whose influence transcends time, a saint for the ages. Thanks for tuning into Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.